In the last video, you saw just how important the datamodel.graphql file is. This file is used by Prisma to determine two very important things. First, this file is used to determine the database structure. So I have a user type here, and that is the only reason why I have a user table down below. On that user type, we've determined we want an ID and a name, and that is the only reason I have an ID and a name field for each user. Now, yes, we do have updated at and created at. We'll learn a bit more about those later in the class. Now, the other important thing that this file is used for is for generating the GraphQL API's schema. As we saw, all of our queries, mutations, and subscriptions are all related to users, and that's because it's the only type we have defined. If we were to define other types, we would have other queries, mutations, and subscriptions for those other types as well. So in this video, we're going to do two things. One, we're going to make some changes to our user type, and two, we're going to add together a post type. In the next video, it'll be your challenge to add the comment type. So let's go ahead and get started by making some changes to the user type. Now, everything we're seeing here was automatically generated as part of the default Prisma project. Now, we do still want a user type in our application, but it's missing some fields. If we go over to schema.graphql, obviously we're missing posts and comments, but we don't even have those related types set up, so let's not worry about them for now. We'll just worry about our scalar fields. We already have ID, we already have name, we don't have email, and we don't have age. Now, we're actually going to ditch age at this point. Age was added to give us a bit more variety using other types as we explored how GraphQL works. But for the final version of this blog app, we're not going to track the age for each user, though we definitely will be tracking their emails, and later on in the course, we'll be adding on other fields like password as we start to get into authentication. For now, though, let's just add that email field into the mix. So over in datamodel.graphql, I am going to list email out, setting it up as a non-nullable string. We can save the file, and now all we need to do is rerun Prisma deploy. That's going to read the contents of this file. It is going to update both the database structure and the GraphQL API to work with this brand new field. So down below, we can just run Prisma deploy from inside of our project. Now, here's the catch. When we run this, it's actually going to fail, and the error message is going to shed some light on what's going on. So we have an error. The error is, of course, related to the user, the only thing we have, and the message is the following. You are creating a required field, but there are already nodes present that would violate that constraint. So it's complaining about email. We've set up email to be a field that every user has to have. Now, when it says nodes, it really just means data. It's talking about our existing users. If I go over to the database, it's saying that it can't automatically update this record because it's not going to be able to add a value for email, which means that this user would be invalid. For the moment, we can work around this just by deleting the record and starting from scratch. So what I'm going to do is delete our one and only user, wiping this table out completely. Then we should be able to rerun Prisma deploy. But this time around, we should not be getting any errors. We should actually see that everything went correctly. And it even describes all of the changes that were made. Right here, we can see that one of the changes made to user was that an email field was created and it has the correct type right here. Now, this means two things. It means one, that our database structure has changed. If I refresh the page, we can see that email has been added. And two, it means that our GraphQL API has changed as well. If I refresh the schema here and open up the documentation for create user, which we can already see is currently invalid, we have our data argument. This time it does still take name, and that is still required, but it now also takes email, which is also required. So the previous create user call we had is no longer valid because there is no email provided. Let's go ahead and set one up. So right here, email, setting it equal to, I'm going to use vikram@example.com. Perfect. Now we can actually go ahead and run this operation, and when we do, it's going to succeed. So right here, we can see that the new user was created. Now in that case, I didn't ask for their email back, which is why I did not get their email, but we can always fetch that using the user's query to make sure it's showing up. So right here, for each user, I'll grab their ID, I'll grab their name, and I'll grab their email. If I fire this one off, we can see we have that data showing up, which is fantastic. Now, of course, over in PG admin, we want to make sure things are looking good here. If I refresh the page, we do have vikram@example.com as the value for our email field. Perfect. So with this in place, the last thing I want to talk about related to the user is what we have right here, the @unique that comes after our ID field definition. What we have right here is a GraphQL directive. A directive is a way to modify the behavior of the field. Now, directives are usually something that we need to create and then use, but clearly we haven't created anything called unique in our code. This one is actually coming from Prisma. So Prisma provides us with various things to make our life a little bit easier. It gives us custom types we'll be talking about soon. It gives us things like directives and more, and the @unique directive, as the name suggests, makes a given field unique. Now, the syntax for this is the following. After the field definition, obviously we don't need a directive, but if we want to use one, we start with the @sign. Then we provide the directive name, in this case, providing unique. Directives, as we'll see later, can also take arguments. Unique does not, so we're going to leave those off, just setting it up exactly like we had it before. Now, what does this do? Well, it makes sure that for every user out there, none of them have the same ID. So we want to make sure the ID is unique for all users stored in the database. Now, this is great for some fields and it's useless for others. For example, the name. The name doesn't need to be unique. There are other Andrew Meads out there. I'm not that special, so I'm not going to put @unique on there. I want everyone to be able to use whatever name they'd like. Email, on the other hand, is something that should be unique to each user, so we can actually enforce that by using the @unique directive. Perfect. Now we have a user definition that's way more real world. I'm going to save datamodel.graphql, and I am going to redeploy the application. Once again, it is going to show us all of the changes it made, and right here, there's just one. It's updated the email field. The field has become unique. Perfect. Now that we have the user type definition in place, let's go ahead and actually create a user with an email before we move on and worry about our other types like post and comment. So I'm going to head over into GraphQL Playground. We have that sitting right here for the Prisma GraphQL API. I'm going to refresh that schema. And over here for create user, what I'm going to do is try to create a user with the email that I've already set up. Now this should fail because once again, this email already exists. I've already added that user. It's sitting right here. So if I were to rerun this, what do I get? I get an error. A unique constraint would be violated on user, and it tells us the exact field it's talking about. It's talking about the email field. So this error tells us that we cannot create a user with this email because it already exists for a different user, and all emails must be unique. Perfect. So now we have a way to really structure and manage our users. Obviously, this user could change their email to vikram2@example.com, and then once again, it would work as expected, as long as they're not exact matches. The last thing I want to do in this video is set up another type. We're going to set up and configure the post type, then we'll be all done and we'll move on to the next video where you will set up and configure the comment type. So pay close attention because you're essentially going to be doing what I do from here to the end in the next video. Over in the old schema.graphql file, we have our post type down below. And to start, we're just going to worry about the fields with scalar types. So we have ID, title, body, and published. We want to bring all four of those over to the brand new file. So right here, a new type post. Like we had before, we're going to have ID of the type ID, and we will use the @unique directive here to make that unique. For IDs, you have to use @unique with Prisma, otherwise you'll get an error. And then we're going to set up title. That'll be a non-nullable string. There's no need to use @unique here. That doesn't really make much sense. And we have body, a non-nullable string. Once again, not using @unique. And finally, we have published. So we have published, and I'm going to have that be a non-nullable Boolean. Awesome. So these are all the fields with scalar types. Now we can actually focus on setting up relationships. I can't set up the comments relationship because the comments type doesn't exist. You'll create that in the next video, but I can set up the relationship between the post and the user, so let's get that done. We're going to be setting up a posts field on user, an array of posts, and we're going to be setting up the author field on the post, which just links to a user. So over here, we're going to have the exact same stuff. On the user, we want posts. It is going to be an array, a non-nullable array, and the elements inside of there will be non-nullable posts. Then down below for post, we are going to add the author field. That'll link to a non-nullable user. Excellent. So now that we have all of this in place, we have user set up, we have post completely set up, and we have the relationship between them defined. Now notice we didn't do anything special here to set up that relationship. We used the exact tools that we already know about. I'm going to save datamodel.graphql, and we're going to go ahead and deploy our application once again. Right here, we're going to get way more changes than we've gotten in the past. So if I scroll up real quick, we can see exactly what this deployment did. For post, it first created the post, and then it created all of the fields associated with the post. For user, it just set up that relationship. Right here, it created that posts field. Now you'll notice that for post and for user, we have type next to each of them. Down below, we also have this other thing, post to user, and this has relation instead of type. So post to user is automatically generated by Prisma, allowing it to set up the necessary tables to create a relationship between users and post. Let's see what all of that looks like by grabbing all of the new tables over inside of pgadmin. So over in pgadmin, I'm going to right-click tables for our database. I'm going to refresh, and we're going to see that 2 new tables have been created. First up, we have, as you might have expected, the post table. The post table contains all of the data for the individual post, but we also have this underscore post to user table. This was automatically generated, and this is where it stores the IDs that link posts to users. So we can say that post with the ID of 1 is associated with the user of the ID of 3 by storing those right inside of here. Now what I'd like to do is actually test all of this out by creating a new post for this user. So I'm going to grab this user's ID. I can just double click the field to bring up the little editor. I'm going to copy it to the clipboard and hit cancel since I don't actually want to change the field's value. Then we're going to move over to GraphQL Playground. I'm going to refresh that schema, and we can explore all of the new stuff available to us. So right here, under queries, we have a query for getting multiple posts and a query for getting individual posts. Under mutations, we have all of the new mutations for our post. We have create post, update post, delete post, and others. And finally, under subscriptions, we have 1 new post subscription. So just like with user, all of these were auto-generated for us based solely off this very small, 8-line type definition. All right, let's go ahead and actually use one of those mutations. We're going to use create post. Now this is where things start to get a bit interesting. We can see that with create post, we get a post back. That's expected. We get back the new post we create. But when it comes to the data, we can see that, yes, we have title, body, and published all there as expected. We also have author though. So author is where we set up the relationship. So all posts have to have an author that wrote them. So we need to set up this relationship when creating a post, just like we did before. But if we actually click this, we can see that it results in us either creating a new user when we create this post or connecting it to an existing user. So right here, what we're going to do is use connect to connect it to an existing user. Now we can connect it to an existing user by anything that makes that user unique. So I could create a new post and say I want it to go to the user with the ID of 4, or I could create a new post and say it belongs to the user with an email of andrew@example.com. Anything that makes the user unique, so not their name, for example. Now let's go ahead and actually use all of this. It can be really tricky to navigate the schema documentation, especially when we have to click so far and we get really nested. But when you see it in action, it's really not going to be that much different from what we're already comfortable doing. So let's knock that out. Right here, we're going to create a new tab. This is where we will define our new post. It is a mutation. We will use the create post mutation that has just been auto-generated for us. We are indeed going to set up arguments as it takes them, and we will also set up our selection set. For the newly created post, I'm going to grab its ID. I'm going to grab the title, and I'm also going to grab the other fields, body, published, and I'll even grab something from the author. I'll grab the author's ID, and I'll grab the author's name. Perfect. Now, when it comes to the arguments, what do we have to provide? We have to provide that 1 argument data. This is indeed an object, and we're going to start by setting up the things that are required. We have to provide the title, body, and published. Let's start there. Title equals Prisma post. Then we have body. Body can be empty, And finally, we have published. Published is going to be either true or false. I'm going to leave this one unpublished, so I'll use false. From here, once again, we have to provide author, which we saw over in the schema. Author itself is an object, so we're going to set it up as such. In here, we can now either create or we can connect. We are going to connect to an existing user by setting up on connect either the ID or the email field. I'm going to link by ID since that's what I copied to the clipboard. So I'll set up ID right here, passing in the ID value as a string. Excellent. Now, all of this might seem like a little much. It's quite a bit of work to provide author, then connect, then ID. It would be nicer if there was something like author ID. Don't worry about that just yet, because we're not actually going to be making almost any GraphQL API requests from GraphQL Playground like this. We'll be using a tool that makes this a bit easier when it comes to interacting with Prisma from Node.js. For now, though, let's go ahead and run this and make sure it's at least working at a basic level. If I fire off this operation, what do I get? I have data, I have create post, and I have everything I asked for about that post. I have its ID, I have the title, I have the body, I have the published status, I have the author's ID, and I have the author's name. Now let's go ahead and explore the data just to get an idea for what this data structure looks like. Over in pgadmin, we are going to crack open that posts table. So I'm just going to right click it. We have view edit data. I'm going to view all rows. And what do I have here? I'm going to end up having a single row, and you can see we have the ID, we have the title, we have body, and we have published all as expected. Now, when it comes to linking the two, linking the user with the post, that happens in post to user. So let's view that table as well. I'm going to right click it, go to view edit data and view all rows. And here we're going to see that we just have one record. We have an ID for this record. Then we have the A and B values. This is the post ID. This is the user ID. Actually, I believe it's the other way around. Either way, by just using these two values, it creates a relationship between those two entities, between a post and a user. So at this point, I don't expect all of this relational data to make sense with Prisma just yet. And if you start to explore some of the other mutations, you're going to see that things can get pretty complex pretty quickly. Don't worry, we're going to dive into how all of this works in detail. For now, we're just going through the process of setting up the basic types we need before we can even really play around with how Prisma functions and why it's useful. So that's where we're going to stop for this one. We've set up our user type and we've set up the post type. In the next video, it's going to be up to you to set up the comment type, and that will be a challenge video. So let's go ahead and jump right in.